Hello. If everything is working properly, you are seeing an image of Mark Edward Ochterman and hearing some kind of resemblance of his voice. Reading an excerpt from Born in the Year of the Roaring Tiger from the Udhivaean Material. Jaipuli was born in the year of the Roaring Tiger in Barabakulam in Melasinga. His parents farmed a strip of land between cane thickets at Barabakulam and the great river Zeloma. When Jaipula was a boy, he looked out between the orange and red curtains of his house to the trees that hid the river's edge, and he watched along the gray-brown dirt track between his house and the river, watched for his father coming home with a catch of fish in a basket, watched for the neighborhood dogs to make their parade. Barabukalam means lots of dogs barking, and there are more dogs than humans in Barabukalam. There are at least 5 dogs for every human, and every day almost all of the dogs gathered at the cane grove, then filed through the village, working each side twice from Auntie Zarpa's to the stronghold of the bitch. During the dog parade, Jaipuli's mother worked hard to block the way into their compound because in just a few minutes, the dogs could ruin everything. She always set out a bowl of cooked peas and grain porridge for the dogs, a big bowl, as a bribe, but she still held the gate firmly as the dogs went by. The rest of the day, only the family dogs were nearby, and Jaipuli's mother could relax her guard. For most of the day, she sat in the shade in the courtyard cooking or spinning lazily. Flies dance in the sun, he remembered she told him, not in the shade. His mother hated flies with a passion that brought gales of laughter from the neighbors. When she carried water out to the men in the fields by the river, she followed the shade carefully to avoid flies. Anyone else would just walk in a straight line, in and out of shade, and swat at flies. Jaipuli walked in a straight line from his house to the river, swatting flies. Along the river came the high-ended Maglond, the polers standing aft, and the cargoes hoisted high toward the prow, bobbing in the heavy riffle. Jaipuli could not see them from his window. The trees hid them. He could not even see the sails of the larger craft that went upriver to Kaibali town. They traveled well out in the channel because the river was full of hidden shallows and snags. Teams sometimes dredged the river, but even so, most ships would hire pilot boats to lead them. Naifar, a boy from Barabukalam with a tiny boat and a big heart, got regular work this way, although he had to work fast to avoid the parcelgahing, the federal or royal licensing inspectors. When Jaipuli tried to recall his first memory of the river, it was always of the rocky shore where the little wash from behind his house came out into the river. Here, because of the wash, you could come down to the river without having to climb down the cliffs, and there was a wide beach of mud and sand with large round boulders at the end of the wash. From these boulders, really, they were never more than 3 feet around, but to a child they seemed larger. Jaipuli and his numerous cousins leaped into a deep pool of the river. This was a bright place, a scorching place all day long, except for a few hours very early. Before sunrise, the aunties and grannies came down the wash and did their due at the river. Once, Jaipali and his friend Narad, Naifar's younger brother, arranged to wake very early to spy on them from the thickets beside the wash. Having crept to the prepared watching place before first light, the boys fell asleep again, waiting, and when they woke, the women were already at the river, and they did nothing particularly interesting, just talking and rinsing out clothing in the water, then walking back up to the village, talking all the way, completely aware of the boys only a few feet away in the underbrush. If any of them had only known, a few feet yet further on, were Mailu and Hanyan from the village, hastening to dress without making a sound, for neither of them were supposed to be out so late, and the arrival of the boys had disrupted their activity, which began with a moonlit swim in the deep pool just beyond the rocks. This was a popular place in the life of the village. Around on the other side of the village, as the villagers said, there was another way down to the river, dominated at the upper end by the Stam Strong Forma, that is, the stronghold of the trading company that controlled the draw. Logs had been set into the banks of the draw perpendicular to the stream, so that most of the year the water in the draw was 3 or 4 feet below the logs. The logs were kept smooth and provided a rolling surface by which boats, or their cargoes, could be hauled up to a wide platform or terrace at the top. At the back of this terrace was a walled enclosure where the Stam Strong Forma had a stronghouse, a storehouse, and a little shed for the accountant, and some sort of dovecote or hen house, and the big house for the manager and her family. Everyone in the village referred to her as the bitch when she was not present, even her own servants, even her own old auntie, who sometimes went out alone to market. When she was present, she was universally addressed as ma'am or mistress. Every year the rains lasted for 3 months, followed by 6 months of mixed rain and hot sunny days, followed by the dry for about 3 months. Sometimes the rains were longer, sometimes the dry. Every year after the rains, as the ground firmed up again and the roads were roads, not brickmakers' ponds, the Durim would come and camp about a league back from the river near the railway to Kaibali. The bitch hired the Durim to cart the goods from the storehouse to the railway, and when that was done, the Durim moved on. Since the bitch owned the scrubland on which the Durim camped, their rent was subtracted from their pay, so the sooner they finished the work, the higher their profit. The bitch explained that this arrangement balanced the natural laziness and shiftiness of the Durim. She had a similar arrangement for the Tukli, who came at the end of the dry, fixing things up and squeezing the last pennies out of the village before the rain made work impossible for 3 months. Sometimes some of the Tukli stayed on through the rains, spinning and weaving all day in the big village sheds and sleeping at night in the rafters there. Jaipali enjoyed the visits from the Durim and the Tukli, and he looked forward to seeing his friends and regretted their leaving. One year, when the Durim packed up and led their elephants away, Jaipali was so upset that his friend Kylie was leaving, he followed after the Durim. He was, after all, born in the year of the roaring tiger. He walked after them through the night and all the next day, and finally reached them, famished, in the afternoon of the day after he set out. He stayed with them that night, camped above Kondali River. But in the morning, Kylie's uncle hired a boat and rowed Jaipali home, crow's nest with crows. From the Tukli, Jaipali learned to make various small repairs to tools and furniture. He was a sort of handyman around the village when he was young. He earned a few smiles and a few coins making repairs when the Tukli were wherever they went when they weren't at Barabakalam. Barabakalam was the bamboo grove and the fields and the river and the wash. It was a gray-brown soil that became impassable when wet and was hard as stone when dry, piled up 40 feet from the riverbed in a great cliff. It was the jumbled houses leaning by the single street, running in an oval, all patches of crazy wood and slate and brick, painted impossible combinations of the most garish colors, advertising to any passerby products that hadn't been available for 100 years. The station, that is, the Stamstrong Forma, had once done a substantial business with the villagers, but now the bitch had hired people from Bow, and they did the work that villagers used to. Now Barabakalam survived by farming and fishing. Jaipali's family's house was at the very top of the wash where the bamboo grew. His family ate the shoots of bamboo and gave them, or sometimes sold them, to others. Jaipali had learned from the Tukli how to cure cane stalks so that they would not split or rot, and he was clever at making things like flutes and musical chimes from bamboo. Every household in the village had at least one set of wind chimes made by Jaipali. He made a flute for the Durham player Naidu, and Naidu referred several other players to Jaipali, but that was the end of his musical career. When Jaipali was 20 and still unmarried, his father collapsed while walking and then was bedridden for some months. Even when he could walk again, Jaipali's father could never do the field work and fishing he had once done, and this fell to Jaipali, who accepted it as a matter of course. Jaipali also accepted his parents' choice of a wife, a third cousin from over the tracks, who was willing to take care of Jaipali's parents rather than remain with her own. The tracks, from which his cousin was over, were the tracks of the rail line that cut from Juha away down the coast and Kaibali. A bright green train, trimmed in red and burnished brass, chuffed by Barabakalam every morning, and every evening it returned, and on its return it stopped for a moment at the station. The train hustlers jumped out, ran along the train, and jumped back on, having performed their duty as briefly as possible. No one could remember a time when anyone got on or off at the Barabakalam station. But hustlers have to hustle, and the village children sometimes gathered to watch their performance. It was a highlight of Jaipali's days during the year his friend Narad began school. He would wait by the station for Narad, and the train always arrived just before his friend, so he could use the sound of the train approaching as his alarm clock. Once a tiger roamed close to Barabakalam. The bloody remains of a goat and remarkable large footprints were the evidence. For days the villagers lived in fear that the tiger might return. Jaipali and Narad were severely beaten when their parents discovered that they had been walking around in the night looking for the tiger, for, after all, had not Jaipali been born in the year of the roaring tiger, surely the flesh and blood tiger would recognize his namesake and leave him unharmed, or even bless him. Yet, Jaipali's mother said, "Did you not think of Narad, born in the year of the goat?" Embarrassed, the boys admitted that they had not considered that threat. These jumbled pictures of childhood and youth emerged from the mumbling lips of a refugee in Bagmasan, high up in Kurna. far from the sea, far from the waves that ate up his life. Jaipali had a shameful childhood memory. He and the other boys of the village naturally went where opportunities presented for sport or, less often, paying work. Although the bitch was generally and genuinely loathed in Barabukalam, she was still a shapely and fine-featured woman, possessed of a commanding presence. The local boys were no match for her. One by one, she lured them in, and only very slowly did they come to realize that they were not each alone, the only one she had ever so lured. Their discomfort kept them silent. One day, after he and several other boys had been trying to assist in unloading a sifta at the Strong Forma, Jaipali was about 13 years old, gangly, knock-kneed, but in his face the promise of a handsome man. As she paid them a few coppers each, the bitch commented on his muscles and laughed, and he blushed, partly thinking she was mocking him and partly thinking she was admiring. When the other boys ran off to find other occupations for what was left of the day, Jaipali lingered just long enough that the bitch, again in an ambiguous tone, invited him to join her for a drink. She offered him salted lemon water, a drink he enjoyed tremendously at that moment, but would never again stomach. With little intervening talk, the bitch was beside him, her robe falling just clear of her nipples, then covering them again as she adjusted the cloth and smiled. The former workers had left with the crew of the sifta. Jaipali was alone with the bitch. She kissed him on the lips and neck, on the chest. He was stripped of his clothes almost without emotion. She, however, remained discreetly wrapped in silk, even as she guided him among her robes and smilingly panted as he fulfilled his imagination. Then she begged him to lie beneath her as she squatted, lowering herself down to him, and then urinated in his mouth and face and howled with laughter as he jumped up, grabbed his clothes, and ran from the forma. He could still hear her laughter while he sluiced his head and shoulders in the little freshet that fed the gully where the canoe drag was built. For almost 12 years he remained silent, thinking that he alone had been so humiliated. Jealously he watched with certainty as other boys went into the forma alone with the bitch. Jaipali was sure she only fucked them. He imagined they must do even more with the bitch than he had. They always seemed to appear the day after completely pleased with themselves. Then Jaipali heard that one of his distant cousins from the other side of the green had complained to his parents, also Jaipali's cousins, that the bitch, who was still the finest-looking woman in the village, had tricked him. Apparently, he had been willing to tolerate the urine, but when she shat on him, he had had too much. Now, within a few days, every man between 13 and 30, it seemed, could lodge a similar complaint. Soon, any thought of litigation vanished, as this was treated as the funniest event in Barabukalam since dogs first barked. And the bitch rose in the local opinion, at least to the degree that she was the source of the generally and loudly enjoyed amusement.